So we're picking up in this video with modernism in architecture, art, and music. And starting with architecture and design. And really the trend here is that people moved away from the ornate to the functional. So basically building buildings that are functional and not necessarily beautiful. So creative artists in the pre-war years and in the 1920s rejected the old values, and instead they favored constant experimentation and a search for new kinds of expression. And this in general became known as modernism. And architects inspired by this had already begun to change the physical framework of urban society, change the shape of cities, figuratively and literally. And in the 1890s, the Chicago School of Architects, which was led by a guy named Louis Sullivan, began to use cheap steel and reinforced concrete and electric elevators to build skyscrapers and office buildings that lacked almost any exterior ornamentation, so totally functional. Sullivan's student, Frank Lloyd Wright, even built a series of radically modern houses, and they featured low lines and open interiors and mass-produced building materials. And so again, the trend was functional and usefulness, functionality and usefulness. And people believed that buildings should serve the purpose for which they were made. There was a guy, a Franco-Swiss architect, Le Corbusier, who wrote Towards a New Architecture in 1923. And this laid out a whole series of guidelines that was supposed to revolutionize building design. And he argued that architects should adopt the latest technologies in their construction practices. And he also said that architects should find beauty in the clean, straight lines of practical construction and efficient machinery. And in Germany, in 1920, a guy named Walter Gropius sort of merged all of this new type of architecture into a single interdisciplinary school called the Bauhaus, and sometimes it's called the Bauhaus movement. But basically, this flourished in the 1920s, and they stressed functionalism and good design for everyday life. And this new movement actually attracted students from all over the world. So again, we see this trend in new artistic movements of radical change and experimentation, just one art form after the other, from Impressionism to Expressionism to Dadaism and Surrealism, just an array of artistic movements that followed one after the other. And the modern paintings and sculptures became increasingly abstract. Commercial art galleries and exhibition halls in major cities exhibited this new work, and young artists flocked to cities in really high numbers to participate in the new movements and hopefully earn a living making art, hoping that some of them could even change the world with their revolutionary ideas. Impressionism came into existence in Paris in the 1870s, and French artists like Claude Monet and Edgar Degas, and then the American Mary Cassatt, tried to portray their sensory impressions, hence Impressionism, in their work. And then there were post-impressionists and expressionists like Vincent van Gogh, who built on Impressionism's motifs of color and light, but added the psychological element to their pictures as well. In Paris in 1907, you have Pablo Picasso and other artists that established Cubism. And this is a highly analytical approach to art that concentrates on geometry of zigzagging lines and sharply angled overlapping planes. In 1916, there was a group of artists and intellectuals in Zurich, Switzerland, who came up with Dadaism. I'll put the spelling for that. And this was just a way pretty much to attack all the familiar standards of art and just, I guess, highlight outrageous behavior. After 1924, many of these people were attracted to surrealism. Like one of the probably the most important or the most well-known surrealists is Salvador Dali. Maybe you've seen that picture with the melting clock, but Dali was deeply influenced by Freudian psychology, and he tried to portray images of dreams and the unconscious in his art, and this was how the psychological element was added. But many of these modern artists really believed that art had a radical mission and that it had the power to produce radical social change by calling attention to the emptiness of mainstream society. And in Europe, just before World War II, art became increasingly politicized. When the National Socialists were in power in Germany, there were hundreds of artists and intellectuals that migrated to the United States to escape the war and the repressive Nazi state. Developments in modern music paralleled those in painting. Composers were trying to express emotional intensity in radically experimental forms. The ballet called The Rite of Spring by composer Igor Stravinsky was so non-traditional that it practically caused a riot when it was first performed in Paris in 1913. And then Alban Berg wrote the opera Wozzeck, but this was just a gruesome tale of a soldier who was pretty much driven to madness and murdered his mistress. And this was first performed in Berlin in 1925. And it blended like a half-sung, half-spoken sort of dialogue with harsh, atonal music. So in addition to Alban Berg, there was a composer named Arnold Schoenberg who also abandoned traditional harmony in favor of this atonal music. And it was basically just independent, unrelated musical notes. And audiences who were used to the harmonies of classical and romantic music couldn't even understand this music that didn't seem to make sense. So an emerging consumer society, and we'll start with mass culture. So in the 20s, there were a number of technological developments that pretty much led to a revolution in the way consumer goods were made, marketed, and even used by ordinary people. The goods themselves even seemed to modernize society by changing some habits. Some people embraced the new ways, and others worried that the modern consumer culture threatened precious traditions. Even within the middle-class home, housework and private life were increasingly organized around an array of modern appliances. And the aggressive marketing of fashionable clothing and personal care led to an obsession with individual attractiveness and even like sex appeal. Commercialized mass entertainment prospered during this time and began to dominate the way that people spent their leisure time. Department stores really epitomized the emergence of this consumer society. Using aggressive advertising campaigns, they used attractive salespeople who were young, easy credit, return policies that would attract customers in droves. And this modern consumer culture sort of undermined and reinforced existing social differences, helping to democratize Western society on the one hand, while on the other hand accentuating the status of ownership with prices that some people just could not afford. The new household appliances during this time had promised to, quote, modernize the housewife's domestic labor and, of course, transform the way women performed housework. There was even talk of the arrival of the new woman, who was an independent female who could vote and hold a job and smoke cigarettes in public and spend her salary on the latest fashions and wear makeup and cut her hair. And part of this was just marketing and stereotyping, but there were a lot of women who did engage in this type of behavior, which sort of loosened the traditional limits on women's behavior. And there were all sorts of complaints from socialist writers on the left who feared that workers would turn into passive consumers, and then conservatives on the right who didn't like the money being spent on mass-produced goods. And then you have religious leaders who feared that materialism was replacing spirituality. Despite those criticisms, though, people still bought mass-produced goods, and they still were a part of this mass consumer society. So both cinema and radio became major industries in the period between the two world wars. And there was eager public enthusiasm for this new media form. By 1910, American directors and business people had set up like movie factories, they were called, in New York and then one in Los Angeles. But World War I really hastened the development of the film industry in the nations that had been involved in the war. National leaders quickly realized that movies offered distraction to troops and to citizens, and maybe even more importantly, were an effective means of spreading propaganda. And so this really became a true mass medium in the 1920s, where filmmaking became big business on an international scale. And motion pictures became the main entertainment of the masses. And there were growing numbers of ordinary people who flocked to these gigantic movie palaces. Even Lenin in the Soviet Union encouraged the development of Soviet movie making because he believed that it was essential to convincing people of his ideology and ideologically transforming his country. The radio. Just like film, radio became a full-blown mass medium in the 1920s, and pretty much every major country very quickly established national broadcasting networks. In the United States, this was mostly done privately and was financed through advertising, but in Europe, the typical pattern was that the government directly controlled the national broadcasting networks. But radio was so well suited for political propaganda, and it allowed dictators like Mussolini and Hitler to control the airwaves and to reach enormous audiences with their frequent and dramatic speeches. But this did offer audiences pleasant distraction on one hand, but on the other hand, it was potentially dangerous, an instrument for political manipulation. We'll go ahead and bring this video lecture to a close, and we'll pick up in the next one with the search for peace and political stability.